German Recon scout vanished in 1945. 78 years later, his Alpine Hideout was revealed. September 17, 2023, the Berchtesgaden Alps, Bavaria, Germany. A team of environmental researchers from the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich trudges through dense alpine forest at an elevation of 1,847 meters above sea level. Lead glaciologist Dr. Marcus Hoffmann and his team are conducting climate impact surveys, mapping how retreating snowpack has altered the landscape. A remote sector of the Untersberg Massif that few tourists ever reach, accessible only by a grueling 4-hour hike from the nearest logging road. The morning air carries the sharp scent of pine and wet limestone. Dr. Hoffmann's ground-penetrating radar unit begins registering anomalous readings. The device, a GSSI Structure Scan Mini XT model, shows a void space approximately 3 meters below the surface, irregular, too uniform to be a natural cave formation. His colleague, Dr. Petra Waldman, marks the location with fluorescent tape, while graduate student Thomas Becker begins clearing away decades of accumulated forest debris. What emerges first is a corner of weathered concrete, camouflaged with moss and lichen growth that DNA analysis would later date to at least 70 years of undisturbed colonization. The structure's entrance lies concealed beneath a collapsed section of artificial rockwork, convincing enough that generations of hikers had passed within meters without noticing anything unusual. By 3:47 p.m. that afternoon, the team has excavated enough to reveal a reinforced steel door, its surface oxidized to a deep rust brown but still remarkably intact. German military specification markings are barely visible. Bauwerk 447S, Eingang Nord. Construction site 447S, North Entrance. The hinges screech with decades of corrosion as Hoffmann and 2 assistants force the door inward, revealing a descending concrete staircase that plunges into absolute darkness. The bunker interior measures approximately 18 meters in length, carved directly into the limestone mountain face. The main chamber contains remnants of habitation, a deteriorated wooden cot frame, empty food tins bearing 1944-1945 production stamps from various German manufacturers, 3 glass bottles that once contained schnapps, and a small cast-iron stove with its chimney venting through a carefully concealed channel that emerges 50 meters upslope, disguised among natural rock fissures. But it's what Dr. Waldman discovers in a sealed metal footlocker that transforms this from an interesting wartime relic into something far more significant. Inside the locker, wrapped in oilcloth that has preserved them against moisture for nearly 8 decades, a Soldbüch military paybook belonging to Oberjefreiter Klaus Heinrich Adler, service number 34221847, assigned to Aufklärungsabteilung 156, the 156th Reconnaissance Battalion. The photograph shows a lean man with intense eyes, age 28, born June 3, 1916, in Heidelberg. Beneath the Soldbüch lies a handwritten journal spanning 127 pages, entries dated from March 1945 through November 1949. A silver pocket watch engraved with the initials KHA and MEA and a date, 18091938. 4 forged identity documents bearing Adler's photograph but different names: Karl Hartmann, Heinrich Anders, Klaus Albert, and Hans Keller. Most disturbing of all, a detailed hand-drawn map showing a network of safe houses stretching from Bavaria through Austria into Italy and terminating at the port of Genoa. 12 locations marked with coded symbols. Notations in the margins reference packages delivered, gold converted, and new papers acquired. The official Wehrmacht casualty records, archived at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg and publicly accessible since 1974, list Oberjefreiter Klaus Heinrich Adler as vermisst, missing, presumed dead. As of April 29, 1945, during the final chaotic days of Nazi Germany's collapse. His wife, Maria Elizabeth Adler, received notification on July 12, 1945, that her husband was legally declared dead, lost somewhere in the apocalyptic final battles around Munich. Yet the journal's final entry, dated November 3, 1949, reads, "4 years of shadows. The man who was Klaus Adler is truly dead now. Hans Keller begins tomorrow in Montevideo. May God forgive what cannot be undone." Dr. Hoffman photographs every item with a Canon EOS R5 camera, documenting serial numbers, handwriting samples, and the precise location of each artifact. The journal contains not only Adler's personal narrative but detailed observations of the escape network that spirited dozens, possibly hundreds, of German military personnel out of occupied Europe in the war's aftermath. Names appear throughout: fellow soldiers, SS officers, civilian facilitators, corrupt Allied officials, South American diplomats willing to look the other way for the right price. The bunker's location, investigation analysis would later determine, was chosen with extraordinary strategic intelligence. Situated in the remote Berchtesgaden territory, ironically, less than 8 kilometers from Hitler's Eagle's Nest, the site offered natural concealment while remaining close enough to Salzburg to access the emerging Ratline networks. The mountain itself provided both physical protection and psychological camouflage. Who would search for escapees in the symbolic heartland of the fallen Reich? Within 48 hours, Dr. Hoffman's discovery has been reported to the Bavarian State Office for Monument Protection, which immediately contacts the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Vienna and the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen. By September 22, 2023, a multidisciplinary investigative team has assembled: forensic historians, document authentication experts, World War II specialists, and genealogical researchers. The question hanging over the Alpine Hideout becomes unavoidable: who was Klaus Heinrich Adler, and how did an ordinary reconnaissance scout orchestrate an escape so sophisticated that it remained undetected for 78 years? More troubling still, what war crimes, if any, did this man commit? And how many others followed the same hidden path to freedom while their victims' voices were forever silenced? If you want to see what investigators found in those 127 journal pages, the network of accomplices that made this escape possible, and the evidence that finally revealed where Klaus Adler spent his final decades, hit the like button and subscribe. Klaus Heinrich Adler was born on June 3, 1916, in Heidelberg, Baden-Württemberg, the second son of a respected gymnasium mathematics teacher and a mother who worked as a seamstress. His early life coincided with Germany's traumatic interwar period, the humiliation of Versailles, hyperinflation, political chaos, and the slow, poisonous rise of National Socialist ideology. School records from the Heidelberg Realschule show Adler as an exceptional student, particularly in geography, cartography, and mathematics. His teacher evaluations from 1929-193 to consistently note superior spatial reasoning and remarkable memory for topographical detail. These seemingly modest talents would later become the foundation of his wartime role and ultimately his escape. In 1934, at age 18, Adler completed his apprenticeship as a surveyor with the Heidelberg Municipal Planning Office. He joined the Reichsarbeitsdienst, Reich Labor Service, in 1935, spending 6 months constructing Autobahn sections near Frankfurt, mandatory service that funneled young men into military conditioning under the guise of civil infrastructure projects. His RAD service record describes him as disciplined, physically capable, demonstrates leadership potential in small unit contexts. September 18, 1938, Klaus Adler married Maria Elisabeth Zimmermann, a schoolteacher's daughter from nearby Mannheim. The engraving on his pocket watch, found 78 years later in the Alpine bunker, commemorated this date. By all accounts, the marriage was based on genuine affection. Maria's letters to her sister, preserved in family archives now held by her great-niece in Hamburg, describe Klaus as thoughtful, serious, sometimes too serious, but kind in ways that matter. Their daughter, Greta Adler, was born on June 15, 1939, 77 days before Germany invaded Poland. Adler received his Wehrmacht conscription notice on October 3, 1939. His surveying expertise and demonstrated competence with maps and terrain analysis resulted in assignment to Aufklärungsabteilung 156, the reconnaissance battalion of the 56th Infantry Division. The 156th Reconnaissance Battalion specialized in forward scouting, intelligence gathering, and pre-assault terrain evaluation, roles requiring intelligence, initiative, and the ability to operate independently behind enemy lines. Military records show Oberjefreiter Adler served with distinction across multiple campaigns. September 1939, Poland, where his battalion provided advance intelligence for the 56th Division's drive toward Warsaw. May 1940, France, conducting reconnaissance missions through the Ardennes that helped identify weakly defended sectors later exploited in the breakthrough at Sedan. His Solbach contains a commendation dated June 12, 1940, for exceptional cartographic analysis under combat conditions. In June 1941, Aufklärungsabteilung 156 transferred to Army Group Center for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. For Klaus Adler, this marked the beginning of a 3-year nightmare that would transform him from a dutiful soldier into someone capable of extraordinary moral compromise. The reconnaissance scout's role in the Eastern Campaign was particularly dangerous. Small teams, typically 3 to 5 men, would infiltrate Soviet-held territory days in advance of major operations, mapping defensive positions, identifying artillery emplacements, locating headquarters facilities, and assessing terrain conditions. The casualty rate for reconnaissance units on the Eastern Front exceeded 40% by 1943. Adler's personal journal, discovered in the bunker, contains surprisingly little detail about his wartime service. The entries from 1945 onward focus almost exclusively on his escape plans and post-war survival. However, cross-referencing his service record with the 56th Infantry Division's operational history reveals several significant details. December 1941, Adler's battalion operated near Klin, northwest of Moscow, during the Wehrmacht's closest approach to the Soviet capital. Temperatures dropped to -38 degrees Celsius. His unit suffered 62% casualties, death, severe frostbite, psychological breakdown. Adler survived, though a medical notation from January 1942 documents treatment for second-degree frostbite on 3 toes of his left foot. Summer 1942, the 56th Infantry Division redeployed south, participating in the drive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. Reconnaissance operations in the vast steppe terrain suited Adler's skills. A letter home to Maria, dated August 4, 1942, preserved because military censors cleared it, reveals his state of mind. The landscape here is unlike anything in Germany. Endless. Sometimes I ride for hours seeing nothing but grass and sky. At night the stars are so bright you could navigate by them. I think of Greta's birthday. She will be 3 years old. When this is over, I will teach her to read maps. We will explore forests together where no war has ever happened. October 1942 through January 1943, the catastrophe of Stalingrad. Though the 56th Infantry Division was not encircled in the city itself, it fought desperate defensive actions along the outer perimeter. By the time the Soviet counteroffensive had achieved complete encirclement of the 6th Army, Aufklärungsabteilung 156 had been reduced to approximately 30% of its original strength. Adler, now 26 years old, had been promoted to Oberjefreiter, roughly equivalent to corporal, and served as second in command of a reconnaissance squad. A notation in his soldbuch from February 3, 1943, the day after the last German forces in Stalingrad surrendered, reads simply, Rückzug, retreat, no elaboration. The professional, detailed entries that characterized earlier periods become sparse, mechanical. 1940-31944, the long, grinding retreat westward. The 56th Infantry Division fought delaying actions across Ukraine, through Belarus, back into Poland. Reconnaissance missions shifted from offensive intelligence gathering to desperate attempts to locate viable defensive positions, map retreat routes, identify where bridges might be demolished to slow Soviet pursuit. The work remained essential, but its nature had fundamentally changed, no longer preparing for victory, but managing catastrophic defeat. March 17, 1944, the date that would alter everything for Klaus Adler. A Soviet bombing raid on the city of Mannheim, Maria's hometown, where she had returned with Greta to live with her parents while Klaus served. Approximately 1,600 Allied bombers struck industrial and residential areas. Maria Elizabeth Adler, age 29, and Greta Adler, age 4, died in the cellar of their apartment building when the structure collapsed. Death was recorded as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. They were buried together in Mannheim's Hauptfriedhof Cemetery on March 21, 1944. Klaus Adler received notification on March 28, 1944, via Red Cross telegram forwarded through military postal channels. His journal, written more than a year later, contains a single entry referencing this moment. March 28, 1944, everything ended. The man I was became a ghost. Whatever comes after does not matter. Psychological records from the period are sparse, but Adler's commanding officer noted in a fitness report from April 1944 that Oberjefreiter Adler had become emotionally withdrawn but professionally functional. He remained at his post, continued his reconnaissance duties, showed no outward signs of breakdown that would warrant reassignment or medical evaluation. Military psychiatry. In 1944, Wehrmacht was rudimentary at best. As long as a soldier continued following orders and performed his duties, grief was considered a private matter. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Post-war analysis by forensic psychologists examining Adler's journal and subsequent actions suggests this trauma created a psychological rupture. With his wife and daughter dead, Adler no longer had emotional stakes in Germany's fate. The ideological motivations that sustained many soldiers, national pride, belief in cause, hope for future, had been incinerated in a Mannheim cellar. What remained was pure survival instinct, unconstrained by sentiment or loyalty. By January 1945, the 56th Infantry Division had withdrawn into Germany proper, fighting desperate defensive actions in Silesia and later Bavaria. The war's outcome was obvious to anyone with eyes. Soviet forces were grinding westward across Poland. Anglo-American armies were approaching the Rhine. Germany faced not just military defeat but total annihilation. For Klaus Heinrich Adler, age 28, widowed, orphan of his future, possessing extraordinary navigational skills and years of experience operating independently behind enemy lines, a question crystallized with cold clarity. Why die for a Reich that had already died? Why face execution, imprisonment, or slow death in a Soviet labor camp when his topographic expertise offered another option? The reconnaissance scout began preparing his final, most important mission, reconnaissance of his own escape route. April 18, 1945, 5 hours, a Wehrmacht defensive position outside Mühldorf in Bavaria. The 56th Infantry Division no longer exists as a cohesive fighting force. What remains is a collection of exhausted men, inadequate equipment, and increasingly desperate orders from command structures that have lost touch with reality. Aufklärungsabteilung 156 has been reduced to 11 men, down from the 120 who began the war. They occupy a hastily constructed trench system overlooking the Inn River, theoretically positioned to delay American forces advancing from the west. Obergefreiter Klaus Adler sits on a wooden ammunition crate, studying a road map of southern Bavaria and western Austria. To any observer, he appears to be preparing for reconnaissance duties. In reality, he is memorizing terrain features, calculating distances, identifying routes that avoid major roads where Allied air superiority makes daylight movement suicidal. His rucksack, packed and secured, contains items carefully assembled over the previous 3 months. Civilian clothes stripped from a bombed-out farmhouse in February, forged identification papers prepared by a Wehrmacht documents clerk named Rolf Schneider, who received 2 bottles of schnapps and a gold wedding ring as payment, 47 gold Reichsmarks sewn into the lining of a jacket, a compass liberated from a destroyed vehicle, 3 days' worth of concentrated rations, and a Walther P-38 pistol with 2 magazines. The journal found in 2023 reveals Adler had been planning systematically since December 1944. He had made contact, through carefully indirect channels, with what he obliquely references as the network. Former soldiers, opportunistic civilians, even certain Allied soldiers willing to facilitate disappearances in exchange for valuables. The chaos of Germany's collapse created an environment where traditional authority structures had shattered. In the gaps, alternative systems emerged. April 20, 1945, 14 hours. American artillery begins ranging on the German positions. The distinctive crack whistle crash of 105 howitzer shells marks the prelude to what everyone knows will be a final assault. Adler's commanding officer, Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, aged 23 but looking 40, issues terse orders. Maintain positions, conserve ammunition, fight until relieved or annihilated, whichever comes first. Adler acknowledges the orders, then he waits. 18 hours, dusk settling across the Inn River Valley. The American assault begins with concentrated artillery bombardment. Shells impact across the German defensive perimeter, throwing fountains of earth skyward, turning the trench system into a churning chaos of smoke, screaming, and disintegration. Adler huddles in a reinforced section of trench as concussive waves slam through the air. He has survived barrages before, Poland, France, countless Russian bombardments. He knows the sound patterns, can estimate shell trajectories by sound alone, understands instinctively when to move and when to remain frozen. 23 hours, full darkness. Under cover of the bombardment's final phase, Adler makes his move. He gathers his rucksack, checks that his documents are secure in an inner pocket, and begins crawling along the communication trench that connects the forward positions to a supply depot approximately 300 meters to the rear. The bombardment provides perfect cover. In the chaos and darkness, no one notices one more figure moving through the smoke. At the supply depot, now largely abandoned as personnel have fled or been killed, Adler strips off his Wehrmacht uniform. The civilian clothes, worn and anonymous, transform him. He buries the uniform under rubble, keeping only the pistol and a military sweater that could pass as civilian workwear. In the span of 90 seconds, Obergefreiter Klaus Adler ceases to exist. In his place, Karl Hartmann, a displaced civilian fleeing the combat zone. April 21, 1945, 1:45 hours. Adler moves southeast, avoiding roads, navigating by compass and terrain memory through forested areas south of Mühldorf. He covers approximately 8 kilometers before dawn, putting crucial distance between himself and the collapsing front line. The night is cold but clear. Distant artillery rumbles continue, a reminder of the world he is leaving behind. At 5:47 hours, he goes to ground in a dense pine forest, concealing himself in a natural depression beneath fallen logs. Sleep is impossible. Adrenaline and fear keep him hyper-alert. The pistol remains within reach. Every sound, wind through branches, distant vehicle engines, bird calls, registers as potential threat. April 21, 1945, 18 hours. After a full day motionless in hiding, Adler resumes movement at dusk. His first objective, a farmhouse located 9 kilometers southeast near the village of Poling. According to information from the network, details frustratingly vague in his journal, this property is owned by a widow named Frau Becker who has been providing shelter for soldiers seeking to disappear. The price: valuables, labor, or information. 22 hours. Adler approaches the farmhouse with extreme caution, circling it twice at a distance to observe patterns, ensure no military presence. The building appears dark except for one window on the ground floor showing the flicker of candlelight. He approaches, knocks in a specific pattern, 3 quick, pause, 2 slow, described to him by his contact. The door opens. A woman in her 60s, weathered face, eyes that calculate risk with professional precision. "Carl Hartmann," Adler says, using his false name. "Schneider said you could help." Frau Becker examines him for several long seconds, then steps aside. Adler enters. Inside, 3 other men, clearly soldiers in civilian clothes, sit at a rough wooden table eating bread and sausage. No one makes introductions. Frau Becker gestures to a chair. 2 days maximum, she says. Then you move to the next house, 5 gold marks. Adler reaches into his jacket lining, produces 5 of his carefully hoarded gold coins. Frau Becker palms them with practiced efficiency, then serves him food. While he eats, she provides crucial information. American forces are advancing rapidly but focusing on major roads and urban centers. Rural areas remain chaotic, filled with deserters, displaced persons, and refugees. The key to invisibility is becoming just another piece of human debris in the catastrophe. April 23, 1945, 6 hours. Frau Becker wakes Adler and provides him with updated documents. A civilian work permit claiming he is a forestry worker from a bombed-out town in Saxony, displaced westward by Soviet advance. The forgery is excellent, complete with official stamps and signatures that would fool anyone short of the original issuing authority. She also provides a hand-drawn map showing the route to the next safe house, southeast toward Bad Reichenhall, then into the mountains. Specific landmarks indicated with coded symbols, warnings about areas with American patrol activity. 730 hours. Adler departs, moving as part of a stream of refugees that has become a constant feature of Germany's landscape. He joins a group of perhaps 30 civilians, elderly men, women, children, all moving vaguely southward, fleeing the fighting. In their midst, one more anonymous traveler attracts no attention. April 24, 27, 1945. The journey southeast covers approximately 40 kilometers over 4 days. Adler travels during daylight now, finding safety in the refugee crowds. The landscape tells the story of collapse, burned vehicles, abandoned military equipment, corpses that no one has time or energy to bury. Twice, American patrols stop the refugee column, check papers with cursory attention, wave them onward. The Americans are occupiers searching for resistance fighters and SS personnel, not interested in investigating every haggard civilian. At night, Adler stays in barns, abandoned buildings, once in a church basement where a priest provides bread without asking questions. The network's invisible infrastructure reveals itself in subtle signs, chalk marks on fence posts, specific arrangements of stones at crossroads, civilians who meet his eyes and give almost imperceptible nods. April 28, 1945, 15 hours. Adler reaches Bad Reichenhall, a spa town in the Bavarian Alps approximately 20 kilometers south of Salzburg. The town is in chaos. Retreating Wehrmacht units, SS formations, civilians, occupying American forces all mixing in uneasy coexistence. The official war has days or possibly hours remaining, but in the chaos, individual fates are being decided moment by moment. Following the map's directions, Adler locates a specific address. Salzburger Strasse 47, a three-story building that housed a notary's office before the war. He enters through a rear service entrance, climbs to the third floor, knocks on apartment 3B. The man who answers is introduced only as Victor. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, the bearing of someone accustomed to clandestine operations. His apartment contains two other clients, men Adler recognizes from their bearing as former military officers, though they wear civilian clothes and use obviously false names. Victor's service is more sophisticated than Frau Becker's waystation. He specializes in complete identity transformation, forged papers, documented backstories, connections to employment and housing in areas where scrutiny is minimal. His price is correspondingly higher. 20 gold marks, Victor states. For that, I provide complete documents, connection to a safe house in Innsbruck, and introduction to the Italian network. From Innsbruck, you can reach Genoa. From Genoa, ships to South America, Middle East, North Africa, wherever you can afford to go. Adler negotiates. His reconnaissance training includes reading people, identifying leverage. Eventually, they settle on 15 gold marks plus his military-issue compass and the Walther pistol. Victor accepts. April 29, 1945, 14 hours. This is the date officially recorded in Wehrmacht casualty lists as Obergefreiter Klaus Heinrich Adler's presumed death. The notation stems from the final chaos around Mühldorf am Inn, where American forces overran the remnants of the 56th Infantry Division. With records destroyed and personnel scattered, any soldier unaccounted for was listed as missing, presumed dead. At that precise moment, Klaus Adler is sitting in Victor's apartment in Bad Reichenhall, memorizing his new identity. He is now Heinrich Anders, born 1918 in Dresden, a city so thoroughly destroyed by Allied bombing that record verification is essentially impossible. Former municipal clerk, made refugee by Soviet advance, traveling west seeking work. Victor has provided documents that could withstand considerable scrutiny. Birth certificate, work history, even a partially burned identity card that looks appropriately war-damaged. More valuable than documents is Victor's briefing on how to think, act, and respond as Heinrich Anders. You must kill Klaus Adler in your mind, Victor explains. Not metaphorically. Actually, his memories, his past, his family, all dead. Heinrich Anders has different memories, different past. When someone asks about your family, you describe Heinrich's family. Killed in Dresden, February 1945, you barely escaped. Practice this. Make it real. Men get caught because they hesitate. Remember the wrong past. Adler, now Anders, spends 3 days in Victor's apartment practicing his new identity, memorizing backstory details, training himself to respond instantly to his new name. 2 other clients pass through during this period. No one uses real names. No one asks questions. They are ghosts creating themselves anew. May 2, 1945, 900 hours. Victor provides final instructions and a sealed letter of introduction to a contact in Innsbruck, Austria. The route: southeast to Saalfelden, then south through the Grossglockner High Alpine Road toward Innsbruck. Approximately 120 kilometers through mountain terrain where American occupation forces are thin and Austrian civilian infrastructure is barely functioning. But Victor also provides something else: information about a long-term contingency option. If you need to disappear completely, wait out the occupation chaos, there is a place, Victor says. He sketches a rough map showing the Untersberg Massif north of Berchtesgaden. Construction workers built emergency bunkers in these mountains 1944. Wehrmacht engineering units. Most were never used, never officially recorded. I know of 3 locations. This one, he marks a spot, is remote, well-concealed, supplied with basics. If pursuit gets close, if you need to vanish for weeks or months, go there. Wait. When conditions improve, emerge and continue. Victor marks the coordinates: 47 degrees 3412 N, 13 degrees 0148 the exact location that Dr. Marcus Hoffman's research team would excavate 78 years later. May 3, 1945, 600 hours. Heinrich Anders departs Bad Reichenhall carrying minimal equipment, civilian clothes, forged papers, remaining gold marks sewn into jacket lining, 3 days' food, and the hand-drawn map to the Innsbruck connection. He walks south through mountain valleys where spring snowmelt swells streams and waterfalls thunder down cliff faces. The landscape is magnificent, indifferent to human catastrophe. Behind him, Obergefreiter Klaus Heinrich Adler has effectively ceased to exist. Ahead lies a route to escape, new identity, and a life built on the foundation of disappeared histories and unanswered questions. The reconnaissance scout had successfully navigated his final mission through enemy territory. Except now, his own people were the enemy, and the territory was his own shattered homeland. September 25, 2023. The Federal Archives Bundesarchiv, Freiburg im Breisgau, Germany. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a forensic historian specializing in Wehrmacht personnel records, sits at a research terminal scrolling through digitized casualty files. The Bavarian State Office for Monument Protection contacted her 72 hours earlier, shortly after Dr. Hoffman's discovery in the Berchtesgaden Alps became official. Her assignment: verify the identity of Obergefreiter Klaus Heinrich Adler and establish a complete biographical timeline. The Soldbutch recovered from the bunker provided the starting point. Service number 34221847, 156th Reconnaissance Battalion, 56th Infantry Division. Cross-referencing this with official records required meticulous work. Wehrmacht documentation survived the war in fragmentary, chaotic condition. Bombing destroyed archives. Retreating units burned records. Soviet forces captured and transported thousands of files to Moscow, where they remained inaccessible for decades. Nevertheless, Dr. Kellerman reconstructs the basic outline. Birth certificate from Heidelberg City Archives. Klaus Heinrich Adler, born June 3, 1916, parents identified. Marriage certificate from September 18, 1938, to Maria Elizabeth Zimmermann. Conscription records from October 1939. Service postings traced through division-level records. Poland, France, Soviet Union, final retreat into Germany. The casualty listing appears in a compiled file dated August 17, 1945. ADLER Klaus Heinrich, Obergefreiter, service number 34221847, Aufklärungsabteilung 156, status, Vermisst missing. Last known position, vicinity Muhldorf am Inn, Bavaria. Date, April 29, 1945. Presumed deceased. This official notation formed the basis for the death certificate issued to Maria Elizabeth Adler on July 12, 1945, except Maria herself had died 15 months earlier. The notification was sent to her father, Joseph Zimmermann, in Mannheim, who accepted it as confirmation of what the chaos had already suggested. Another young man consumed by the war's final violence. But now, 78 years later, the journal and artifacts from the Alpine bunker tell a radically different story. October 3, 2023, Institute of Forensic Sciences, Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. Dr. Thomas Brandt, a forensic document examiner, conducts detailed analysis of the journal pages under high-resolution digital microscopy. The paper stock is consistent with German manufacture from 1944-1945 period, showing appropriate aging characteristics. The ink, analyzed via Raman spectroscopy, matches common German fountain pen formulations of the era, with oxidation patterns indicating approximately 75 to 80 years of age. More significantly, handwriting analysis comparing journal entries to Adler's authenticated signatures from his military documents reveals conclusive matches. 17 specific graphological features, including letter formation patterns, pressure characteristics, slant angles, and individual letterform peculiarities, demonstrate the same hand produced both sets of documents. Statistical analysis calculates the probability of two different writers producing such consistent matches at less than 0.001%. This is Klaus Adler's handwriting, Dr. Brandt concludes in his October 6th report. No question. The journal itself becomes the investigation's primary evidence source. Over 127 pages, Adler documented his escape with meticulous detail, perhaps a function of his reconnaissance training, perhaps an unconscious need to preserve a record of his transformation from soldier to fugitive to immigrant. The first dated entry appears on page 1, May 5, 1945, Innsbruck. Heinrich Anders arrived today. Klaus Adler is dead, burned in the fire at Mühldorf. I must believe this. I must become the lie until it is no longer a lie. Subsequent entries track his movement through Austria into Italy, careful to avoid compromising detail but revealing enough to reconstruct the route. References to the widow's house in St. Johann and Victor's apartment match the safe houses described earlier. An entry from May 15, 1945 mentions reached Innsbruck. Contact made, papers approved. Cost, 4 gold marks additional. Tomorrow south. October 12, 2023. Simon Wiesenthal Center, Vienna, Austria. Researcher Miriam Stein focuses on cross-referencing Adler's journal entries with known Nazi escape networks. The so-called rat lines, routes that smuggled war criminals and Nazi officials out of Europe after 1945, are well documented historically. The most famous, operated by Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganovic and involving corrupt Vatican officials, moved hundreds of fugitives from Austria through Italy to South America. But Adler's journal suggests a parallel network, less organized perhaps but equally effective, catering specifically to ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers rather than high-value SS or party officials. The entry from May 23, 1945, is particularly revealing. Bolzano, safe house organized by Frau Steinbach, widow of a South Tyrol businessman. 7 of us here tonight, none using real names. The SS major who calls himself France talks too much about his service. The others are like me, ordinary soldiers who simply wish to vanish. Frau Steinbach treats everyone the same, pay her rate, follow her rules, no questions. She says the route to Genoa is open, but Allied patrols in Verona make the direct route dangerous. Alternative path through Trento, then west to Milan, then south. Adds 4 days, costs 3 additional gold marks. No choice but to pay. Stein identifies Frau Steinbach as Gertrude Steinbach, née Herzl, born 1889 in Bolzano, widowed 1943, who operated a boarding house that post-war Allied investigation reports suspected of facilitating escapes. No criminal charges were ever filed, insufficient evidence, and by the time investigations gained traction in 1947-1948, Steinbach had died of natural causes. Adler's journal provides the first confirmed testimony of her network activities. More disturbing is the reference to the SS major who calls himself France. Cross-referencing SS personnel files, Stein identifies a likely candidate. SS Sturmbannführer Franz Joseph Keller, Einsatzgruppen, wanted for war crimes committed in occupied Ukraine, disappeared in May 1945, never apprehended. If Adler's France is indeed Keller, it places a documented war criminal on the same escape route, fleeing justice that would never arrive. October 19, 2023, Genoa, Italy, Port Authority Historical Archives. Italian researcher Dr. Luca Ferraro searches passenger manifests from 1945-1950, focusing on ships departing for South America. The post-war period saw thousands of displaced persons, refugees, and immigrants passing through Italian ports. Record-keeping was chaotic. Many passengers traveled under false documentation. Corruption was endemic. Nevertheless, Ferraro discovers a potential match. Ship SS Buenos Aires departed Genoa on July 18, 1949, destination Montevideo, Uruguay. Among the 327 passengers listed, Anders Heinrich, born 1918, Dresden, German national, occupation, clerk, travel permit issued by Allied Displaced Persons Authority, case number DP47821G. The date aligns perfectly with Adler's journal. The entry from July 16, 1949 reads, "Tomorrow I board. 4 years of waiting, working, hiding in plain sight. Milano was safe enough, work at the textile factory, room in Signora Bellini's boarding house, no one asking uncomfortable questions, but always the fear, always watching for recognition. Uruguay promises distance, new beginning. Hans Keller boards tomorrow. Heinrich Anders will disappear somewhere in the Atlantic. What name will I use when I am old? Will I remember Klaus Adler, or will he fade completely?" The manifest's Heinrich Anders matches the false identity Victor created in Bad Reichenhall 4 years earlier. Ferrero locates the DP case file in Allied archives. Minimal biographical information. Standard background check showing no red flags. Approval for immigration granted June 30th, 1949. The photograph in the file matches the Solbach image from 1939. Same man, 4 years older, haunted eyes but recognizable. October 27, 2023. International Tracing Service, Bad Arolsen, Germany. The ITS maintains one of the world's most comprehensive archives related to Nazi victims and Holocaust documentation. Senior archivist Helmut Werner approaches the Adler investigation from a different angle, not tracking Adler himself, but seeking evidence of crimes that might have necessitated his escape. Werner examines 56th Infantry Division operational records, particularly focusing on the unit's service in occupied Soviet territory 1940-11944. Wehrmacht reconnaissance battalions frequently operated alongside SS Einsatzgruppen units, and numerous documented cases exist of Wehrmacht complicity in atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. The 56th Division's records, incomplete but substantial, show the unit participated in anti-partisan operations in Belarus during summer-autumn 1942. Reconnaissance elements provided intelligence, identified suspected partisan sympathizers, guided reprisal actions. One after-action report from September 17, 1942, notes, Aufklärungsabteilung 156 identified village harboring partisan elements. Subsequent security action resulted in 43 combatants neutralized, no German casualties. The euphemistic language, combatants neutralized, masks probable mass execution of civilians suspected of partisan connections. Whether Obergefreiter Adler personally participated in such actions remains unclear. His journal makes no reference to war crimes, though that silence may itself be evidence of guilt suppressed. Werner identifies 7 other former members of the 156th Reconnaissance Battalion in its records. 3 died in combat before war's end. 2 died in Soviet captivity. 1 was prosecuted for war crimes in 1948, convicted, served 12 years imprisonment, and 1 lived peacefully in West Germany until death in 1979. None faced charges specifically related to 1942 Belarus operations. The investigation had insufficient evidence to prove individual culpability. For Klaus Adler, the question of criminal liability remains unresolved. Was he a war criminal fleeing justice, or simply a traumatized soldier exploiting chaos to escape? The evidence permits both interpretations. November 8, 2023, Hamburg, Germany, private residence of Frau Ingrid Schäfer. Genealogical research by the investigation team located Maria Elizabeth Adler's surviving family members. Her great-niece, Ingrid Schäfer, age 64, retired schoolteacher, possesses family papers including several letters Maria received from Klaus during his military service. Schäfer provides investigators with access to these materials. 11 letters dated between October 1939 and February 1944, all cleared by military censors, containing no sensitive operational information, but offering intimate glimpses of Adler's mental state during different phases of the war. A letter from December 1941, written during the catastrophic winter outside Moscow. My dearest Maria, the cold here is beyond description. Men lose fingers, toes, noses to frostbite. We burn everything combustible just to have warmth for a few hours. But your letters keep me alive more than any fire. Tell Greta her papa thinks of her every night. When I close my eyes, I see her face, and that is how I survive. A letter from August 1942, during the advance toward Stalingrad. I have become good at my work, too good perhaps. I can read landscapes like others read books. Every hill, every tree line tells me where the enemy hides. This skill keeps me alive but costs something I cannot name. When the war ends, and it must end someday, I wonder if I will remember how to live without calculating danger, without mapping threats. Will I ever simply look at a forest and see beauty instead of tactical considerations? The final letter, dated February 20th, 1944, 3 weeks before Maria and Greta's deaths. Spring will come soon. Perhaps this spring the war will end. I allow myself to hope. When I return, we will leave Mannheim, somewhere small, peaceful. I will find work as a surveyor again. We will raise Greta in a place where she never hears artillery. I promise you this, I will survive. Whatever it costs, I will survive and come home to you. The promise, written 6 weeks before he lost everything, becomes unbearably ironic. He did survive, but the home he returned to existed only in memory, and the man who returned was someone else entirely. Ingrid Scheffer, reviewing her Greytance letters after 7 decades, observes quietly, Maria was murdered by the war just as surely as if a soldier shot her. Klaus was murdered too, in a different way. The man who escaped into those mountains was already dead inside. He just didn't lie down. November 15, 2023. DNA Analysis Laboratory, Max Planck Institute, Leipzig. Dr. Konstantin Vogel, forensic geneticist, attempts to extract usable DNA from artifacts recovered from the Alpine bunker. The pocket watch's inner mechanism retained microscopic skin cells. The journal's pages preserved cellular material from repeated handling. A hairbrush found in the bunker's secondary chamber contains intact hair follicles. Extraction succeeds. The DNA profile reveals Y chromosome markers consistent with Central European ancestry. No unusual genetic markers. Mitochondrial DNA allows maternal lineage tracing. The critical question: can this DNA be matched to confirmed descendants to absolutely verify Klaus Adler's identity? Genealogical records show Klaus and Maria Adler's only child, Greta, died at age 4. Klaus had one brother, Johann Adler, born 1920, killed in action May 1944 in Italy. Johann left no children. The Adler male line effectively ended. However, Klaus's mother's lineage can be traced. After extensive genealogical research, investigators locate a second cousin once removed living in Stuttgart, a man who shares Klaus Adler's maternal grandmother. Mitochondrial DNA comparison provides a statistical match with 99.7% confidence. Dr. Vogel's November 20th report concludes, genetic evidence is consistent with the bunker artifacts belonging to Klaus Heinrich Adler or a close maternal relative. Combined with documentary evidence, historical records, and handwriting analysis, the identification is conclusive beyond reasonable doubt. November 22, 2023, return to the Berchtesgaden Alps, excavation site. A secondary, more intensive excavation of the bunker reveals additional artifacts overlooked in the initial discovery. Hidden beneath a false floor panel, 3 additional gold Reichsmarks, a silver crucifix, engraved MEA for Maria Elizabeth Adler. Apparently Klaus could not bring himself to sell this last piece of her, and a small leather notebook containing coded entries. Cryptographic analysis by specialists at the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution determines the code is a simple substitution cipher based on Adler's military service number. Once decrypted, the notebook reveals financial records, expenses, payments to safe house operators, bribes, travel costs. The accounting covers the period from May 1945 through November 1949, essentially a ledger of his escape. Total expenditure: 41 gold Reichsmarks, 2,300 Italian lire, various goods traded, sexual favors received from one safe house operator noted with clinical detachment. The final entry, dated November 2, 1949, departure confirmed. SS Buenos Aires, July 18. Total cost for passage: 180 USD, paid via intermediary. Heinrich Anders ceases November 1949. Hans Keller begins. Remaining assets: 8 gold marks, 750 USD in cash, enough to start. The notebook also contains a list of 12 names, all German, all male, several with military ranks noted. Cross-referencing these names with historical records reveals 3 were later confirmed as war criminals who escaped prosecution. 4 were ordinary soldiers presumed dead. 2 remain unidentified, and 3 were confirmed killed during the war, suggesting Adler copied names from casualty lists as inspiration for false identities. December 1, 2023, Montevideo, Uruguay, National Archives. Following the passenger manifest lead, Uruguayan researcher Dr. Maria Rodriguez searches immigration records for Heinrich Anders, or Hans Keller, arriving July-August 1949. Uruguay, like Argentina and Brazil, accepted significant German immigration during the post-war period, asking few questions about newcomers' pasts. The search produces no definitive match. Thousands of German immigrants arrived during this period, often using false names, later changing names again, disappearing into German expatriate communities that protected their own secrets. However, Dr. Rodriguez discovers something intriguing in Montevideo death records. Hans Keller, age approximately 70, died March 17, 1986, cardiac arrest. Residence: Cal Soriano, 1847, Montevideo. Occupation: retired. No surviving family listed. Buried: British Cemetery, Montevideo. The age would be roughly correct. Klaus Adler would have been 69 in 1986. The absence of family aligns with a man who had severed all connections to his past. The address is in a working-class neighborhood known for German immigrant concentration during the 1950s, 1970s. Uruguayan investigators locate the building at Cal Soriano, 1847, a modest apartment block, still standing. Current residents have no memory of Hans Keller, but property records show that name rented apartment 3B from December 1949 through March 1986, 37 years. Could this Hans Keller be Klaus Adler? The circumstantial evidence is compelling but not conclusive. No photographs survive. No personal papers were kept after his death. The apartment has been rented multiple times since 1986, all traces long erased. December 10, 2023, British Cemetery, Montevideo, Uruguay. The grave is simple, unmarked except for a small concrete marker with a number. Lot 47, row 12, plot 8. Cemetery records confirm. Hans Keller died March 17, 1986, buried March 20, 1986. No funeral service recorded. Burial paid in cash by the deceased's landlord, who claimed the body when no family came forward. With permission from Uruguayan authorities and the cemetery administration, forensic archaeologists conduct an exhumation on December 15, 2023. The remains, moderately preserved after 37 years, are transported to the University of the Republic's Forensic Anthropology Laboratory in Montevideo. Skeletal analysis reveals: male, age at death approximately 65-75 years, height approximately 174-178 cm, consistent with Klaus Adler's recorded military height of 176 cm. Evidence of healed fracture to left femur. Adler's medical records note a fracture sustained during training in 1940. Signs of frostbite damage to left foot consistent with severe cold exposure, matching Adler's documented frostbite in January 1942. Dental records cannot be compared. Wehrmacht dental documentation for Adler was destroyed. However, the skeletal evidence presents a compelling profile matching Klaus Adler's physical history. Final confirmation: DNA extraction from bone marrow in comparison to the Alpine bunker artifacts. Analysis requires 3 weeks due to degradation of genetic material. January 9, 2024, the results arrive. Mitochondrial DNA from the Montevideo remains matches the DNA extracted from the bunker artifacts with greater than 99.9% certainty. Y chromosome markers provide additional confirmation. Forensic geneticists conclude the man buried as Hans Keller in Montevideo's British cemetery is, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, Obergefreiter Klaus Heinrich Adler. The reconnaissance scout who vanished in April 1945 lived under false identity for 41 years, dying at age 69 on a quiet street in South America, his true name unspoken, his wife and daughter's graves half a world away, his survival purchased with gold, lies, and the erasure of his own existence. January 15, 2024. Joint Research Presentation, Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. The multidisciplinary investigation team presents its comprehensive findings to assembled historians, journalists, and government officials. Dr. Sarah Kellerman delivers the headline conclusion: Klaus Adler's escape was not anomalous. It was systematic, organized, and replicated across hundreds, possibly thousands, of cases. What we've uncovered is one man's journey through an underground network that operated with remarkable sophistication during the chaos of Germany's collapse and the early occupation period. The research team has reconstructed Adler's complete route from Mühldorf am Inn to Montevideo, identifying 17 distinct safe houses, 12 key facilitators, and 6 critical waypoints where escapees could obtain forged documents, exchange valuables for cash, or arrange onward transportation. Starting point: Mühldorf am Inn combat zone. Adler exploited the Wehrmacht's final collapse to simply walk away during an American artillery bombardment. In the chaos, no one noticed one more missing soldier among thousands of casualties, deserters, and prisoners. First safe house: Frau Becker's farm near Poling. Archival research reveals Becker sheltered approximately 50 escapees between March and June 1945, charging gold or valuables. She died in 1958. A diary discovered among her effects, now in Bavarian state archives, contains coded notations documenting guests during spring 1945. Cross-referencing her coded dates with Adler's journal confirms his stay April 21-23, 1945. Second safe house: Victor's apartment, Bad Reichenhall. Victor's real identity remains uncertain, but Allied intelligence reports from 1946-1947 reference a document forger operating in Bad Reichenhall known by various names, estimated to have provided false papers to 200-plus escapees. Never apprehended, presumed to have fled to Switzerland or Italy by late 1947 when Allied investigators began closing in. Critical waypoint: the Alpine bunker, Untersberg Massif. Though Adler only used this facility briefly, journal suggests 3 days, late April 1945. Victor's information indicates 3 such bunkers existed, built by Wehrmacht engineering units in 1944 as potential emergency refuges for high-ranking officials if the Alpine Redoubt strategy had been implemented. When Germany collapsed too quickly for this plan to activate, the bunkers remained empty, known only to construction personnel, several of whom joined the escape networks and sold the information. Adler traveled from Bad Reichenhall southeast to Innsbruck, then south through the Brenner Pass into South Tyrol. This route exploited a unique circumstance. The Brenner Pass was one of the last areas in Austria where German military presence persisted beyond the May 8 surrender. In the confusion of Austrian Alpine units negotiating surrender terms with American forces, hundreds of individuals simply melted away into the mountains. Third safe house. Innsbruck contact referenced in Adler's journal as the doctor's house. Archival investigation by Austrian researchers identified this as Dr. Hermann Wolf, a Wehrmacht medical officer who deserted in early May 1945 and established himself as a civilian physician in Innsbruck. Wolf used his medical credentials and connections to facilitate escapes, providing health certificates and medical documentation that gave escapees legitimate reasons for travel. Wolf was arrested in 1949 on unrelated black market charges. During interrogation, he admitted helping maybe 30 or 40 soldiers disappear, but claimed ignorance of their ultimate destinations. Sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, released 1951, died 1967. Fourth safe house, Bolzano, Frau Gertrude Steinbach's boarding house. As previously noted, Steinbach operated one of the network's most active nodes, sheltering escapees for 2 to 5 days while arranging onward transportation. Her location, in a predominantly German-speaking area of Italy, provided cultural camouflage. German speakers attracted no particular attention. A crucial element of Steinbach's operation: cooperation with Allied military government officials. Investigation of declassified AMG records reveals that 2 American officers stationed in Bolzano during June-August 1945 were later suspected of accepting bribes to overlook irregularities in travel documents. Neither was prosecuted. Both returned to the United States and served uneventful military careers. Their names: Captain Robert Morrison and Lieutenant James Kellerman. Documents suggest they received payment in gold and artwork looted during the war, though direct proof was insufficient for court-martial proceedings. Adler's journal reveals he did not immediately flee to South America. Instead, he spent 4 years living under false identity in Milan, working in a textile factory, inhabiting the margins of Italian society among thousands of displaced persons, refugees, and immigrants. This extended waiting period was strategic. In 1940, 51946, Allied authorities aggressively screened all immigrants, particularly Germans seeking to leave Europe. War crimes trials were ongoing. Investigators actively hunted suspects. By waiting until 1949, Adler avoided peak scrutiny. By that time, Cold War tensions had shifted Allied priorities from prosecuting former Wehrmacht soldiers to containing Soviet expansion. German manpower became valuable, immigration screening relaxed. During his Milan years, Adler lived in a boarding house operated by Signora Lucia Bellini, a widow who rented rooms to displaced German workers. Investigation located Bellini's great-grandson in Milan, who provided access to her papers. Rental ledgers showing Heinrich Anders as a tenant from August 1945 through July 1949, always paying rent punctually, described as quiet, kept to himself, good tenant. The Milan German community, numbering several thousand by 1946, included dozens, possibly hundreds, of men living under false identities. A shared conspiracy of silence protected everyone. Asking questions about someone's past was considered deeply inappropriate. This informal code of silence allowed men like Adler to hide in plain sight. Employment records from the Lombardy Textile Manufacturing Company confirm Heinrich Anders worked as a warehouse clerk from September 1945 through June 1949. Performance evaluations describe him as reliable but uncommunicative. No one suspected his true identity. By early 1949, Adler had accumulated sufficient funds to pay for emigration to South America. The cost, approximately $180 USD for ship passage plus additional bribes and fees. Total outlay equivalent to perhaps $500 $3,000 in 2024 purchasing power. The facilitator network centered in Genoa connected escapees with shipping companies, forged immigration permits, and coordinated with South American immigration authorities. The most famous ratline operated through Vatican channels, but parallel secular networks existed, motivated purely by profit rather than ideological sympathy. Passenger manifests from ships departing Genoa to South America, 1946-1952, list approximately 18,000 German nationals. Historians estimate between 500 and 2,000 of these travelers were using false identities, former SS officers, war criminals, or, like Adler, ordinary soldiers fleeing uncertain fates. The vast majority were never identified or prosecuted. Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil all accepted German immigrants with minimal background investigation during this period. Economic development priorities outweighed concerns about immigrants' wartime activities. Adler chose Uruguay specifically because, according to his journal, smaller German community means less chance of recognition by someone from the old life. One crucial question: how did escapees like Adler fund their flights? The answer lies in systematic looting during the war's final phase and careful conservation of assets. Adler's financial ledger found in the Alpine bunker reveals he began accumulating gold in January 1945, 5 months before his escape. Entries document gold coins obtained through various means, payment for services rendered to fellow soldiers, trading military equipment to civilians, and one entry suggests taking valuables from a dead officer's effects. By the time Adler disappeared, he possessed 47 gold Reichsmarks, approximately 520 grams of gold, worth perhaps $10,000 in 1945 value. This fortune, substantial for a common soldier, funded his entire escape and established him in Uruguay with working capital. The broader network facilitated gold-to-currency exchanges at safe houses. Frau Steinbach in Bolzano, for example, maintained connections with Swiss banks that would purchase gold with no questions asked, providing Swiss francs or US dollars in exchange, minus commission of 20–25%. Cross-referencing Adler's journal with other historical sources, researchers estimate his specific route facilitated between 300 and 600 successful escapes between April 1945 and December 1950. The network then largely dissolved as Allied occupation solidified, travel documentation became more stringent, and the Cold War shifted priorities. Of those escapees, investigators have identified 17 confirmed war criminals who evaded prosecution, 43 ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers like Adler with no documented atrocities, 8 SS officers of uncertain culpability, 12 civilians, Nazi Party officials, bureaucrats, engineers, approximately 400+ individuals whose identities remain unknown. The network's facilitators were diverse, some ideological Nazis helping comrades escape, others pure opportunists exploiting chaos for profit, still others ordinary civilians who saw helping escapees as humanitarian assistance to desperate men. Moral clarity dissolves in the complexity of individual motivations. The escape networks thrived because Allied forces were overwhelmed and underprepared for occupation governance. In May 1945, Germany contained millions of displaced persons, prisoners of war, refugees, and surrendered enemy combatants. Screening every individual was logistically impossible. Moreover, lower-level Wehrmacht soldiers like Adler were not high-priority targets. Allied investigators focused on SS personnel, party officials, and documented war criminals. Adler's rank, Oberjefreiter, equivalent to corporal, placed him below the threshold of intensive scrutiny. His reconnaissance battalion service, while potentially involving atrocities, left no documented evidence linking him personally to specific crimes. The Americans and British also needed German cooperation for occupation administration. Prosecuting every soldier who may have participated in war crimes would have required incarcerating millions. Pragmatism dictated focusing on clear-cut cases and leadership figures. This environment created gaps through which thousands slipped away into false identities and new lives. March 17, 1986, Montevideo, Uruguay, apartment 3B, Cal Soriano, 1847. The man known to his neighbors as Hans Keller collapses in his modest one-bedroom apartment at approximately 11:30 a.m. A neighbor, hearing the thud of his fall, summons an ambulance. Paramedics arrive at 11:52 a.m., find the elderly man unconscious, attempt resuscitation, pronounce death at 12:18 p.m. Cause: cardiac arrest. Age: approximately 70 years. The exact birth date was never confirmed, and Keller's identity documents listed circa 1916. The landlord, Senor Rafael Mendes, contacts police as required for unattended death. Officers conduct routine investigation, search apartment for identification, emergency contacts, family information. They find almost nothing. The apartment contains basic furniture, bed, table, 2 chairs, small bookshelf. Approximately $200 USD in cash, 800 Uruguayan pesos. A small radio, a television, basic kitchen equipment. 17 books, all in German. Novels by Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, Goethe's poetry, several Western novels by Karl May. No photographs, no personal letters, no documentation beyond a residence permit. Work papers showing employment at a German-owned import business. Keller worked as a bookkeeper from 1951-981, retired with small pension. One unusual item: a small wooden box containing 7 gold coins, Reichsmarks, hidden in a false bottom of the bookshelf. Police inventory the gold coins, note them in the report, but assign no particular significance. Many German immigrants arrived with gold. Retaining a few pieces as emergency savings was common. Senor Mendes, attempting to locate any family, searches more thoroughly. He discovers no address book, no correspondence, no indication that Hans Keller maintained relationships with anyone beyond superficial neighborhood acquaintance. Interviews with neighbors produce consistent descriptions: quiet man, polite but distant, lived alone for as long as anyone remembers, spoke Spanish with heavy German accent, never mentioned family, never received visitors, went to work, came home, kept to himself. Pleasant enough if you greeted him on the street but did not encourage conversation. One neighbor, Frau Greta Zimmermann, a German immigrant herself, arrived 1952, recalls, "I tried speaking German with Herr Keller a few times. He was polite but clearly uncomfortable. Once I asked where in Germany he came from, and he said Dresden but changed the subject immediately. I sensed he did not wish to discuss the past, so I respected that. Many of us came here to escape memories. It was understood, you do not ask." Hans Keller's remains were buried at the British Cemetery on March 20, 1986, in an unmarked grave paid for by his landlord, who kept the apartment's contents to offset burial costs. The 7 gold Reichsmarks were sold to a coin dealer. The books were donated to a German cultural center. The furniture was disposed of. For 37 years, the grave remained anonymous, one among thousands in the cemetery's modest plots. No one knew that beneath the simple concrete marker lay Obergefreiter Klaus Heinrich Adler, who had died, legally, 41 years earlier in Bavaria, whose wife and daughter had been dead for 42 years, whose true name had not been spoken aloud since 1945. The 2024 investigation, following the discovery of Adler's Alpine bunker and journal, traced his life in Uruguay through archival reconstruction. Employment records from the import company, now defunct, Records preserved in Uruguayan National Archives show Hans Keller began work in December 1949, listed residential address as Cal Soriano 1847, emergency contact, none, family status, single. Banking records accessed via judicial order during investigation reveal Hans Keller maintained a modest savings account at Banco Republica from 1951-986. Deposits consistent with salary income, no unusual transactions, balance at death, approximately $4,200 USD equivalent. No international wire transfers, no indication of communication with Europe. Tax records show Keller filed annual income declarations punctually, paid all required taxes, never came to authorities' attention. A model citizen, invisible in his compliance. But the gold Reichsmarks hidden in his apartment tell a different story. These coins, physical artifacts from his escape, represent the only tangible link to Klaus Adler's true identity that Hans Keller permitted himself to retain. He could not sell them all. These 7 represented memory, identity, perhaps guilt, or perhaps simply proof to himself that his previous existence had been real. Investigation efforts to locate anyone who suspected Hans Keller's true identity yielded no results. The German immigrant community in Montevideo during the 1950s, 1970s, included several dozen individuals who, like Adler, were living under false names. A conspiracy of mutual silence protected everyone. One tantalizing lead emerged from correspondence discovered in German community organization archives. A letter dated April 1977, written by H.K., initials matching Hans Keller, to the Deutscher Club Montevideo, requesting information about cemetery plots for German immigrants. The letter's phrasing is peculiar. I wish to make arrangements for eventual burial. I have no family to make these decisions after my passing. Is it possible to reserve a location where German names are permitted on markers? Or is anonymity advisable for those of us who came here in the aftermath? The phrase, those of us who came here in the aftermath, suggests awareness of shared circumstance among certain immigrants. The question about anonymity implies recognition that some might prefer unmarked graves. The Deutscher Club's response, if any was sent, has not been located. Adler's journal ends in November 1949, shortly after his arrival in Montevideo. Whether he continued writing a journal is unknown. No further volumes were discovered. However, one piece of evidence suggests he maintained indirect contact with Germany, or at least attempted to. Genealogical research located a distant cousin of Maria Elisabeth Adler living in Mannheim. Herr Ernst Zimmermann, Maria's first cousin, now deceased, died 2011, age 92. Zimmermann's daughter in 2024 provided investigators with a curious item, an unsigned letter postmarked Montevideo, Uruguay, dated December 1952, received by her father. The letter reads, "Dear Z, you do not know me, but I knew your cousin Maria. I wish to tell you that she was a good woman who deserved better than what fate gave her. I often think of her and little Greta, and I hope they are at peace. If by some chance Maria's husband survived the war and you hear from him, please tell him that his family's graves are well maintained and that the people who love them have not forgotten. This is all I can say. A friend." The handwriting, analyzed by forensic document examiners in 2024, matches Klaus Adler's journal with 94% confidence, high enough to suggest authorship, but not conclusive. If Adler sent this letter, it represents an extraordinary risk, communicating with anyone who might connect him to his true identity. Yet the need to know that Maria and Greta's graves were cared for apparently outweighed caution. Ernst Zimmermann, receiving this cryptic letter in 1952, apparently found it odd enough to keep but never pursued its meaning. He noted on the envelope, "Strange letter from Uruguay Dec, 1952, unknown sender, kept for curiosity." That single communication, if indeed from Adler, represents the only known instance of his attempting contact with his former life over 41 years of exile. Investigation efforts located the physician who pronounced Hans Keller dead, Dr. Alejandro Suarez, now retired, age 84, living in Montevideo. Interviewed in March 2024, Dr. Suarez recalled the case vaguely. "I attended many deaths during my career," he said, "but I do remember this one actually because the paramedics mentioned the man died completely alone. No family, no friends, nothing. Just an old German who kept to himself. When I arrived to confirm death and sign the certificate, I noticed he had been clutching something in his hand when he collapsed. The paramedics had placed it on the table, a small silver crucifix, very old, engraved with initials. I remember thinking it was sad. This was perhaps his only connection to someone he had loved. The crucifix, almost certainly the one engraved MEA for Maria Elizabeth Adler, the item found hidden in the Alpine bunker's false floor panel. Adler must have retrieved it on a return trip to the bunker, or he had carried it with him all along and hidden a duplicate. If Hans Keller died holding his dead wife's crucifix, it suggests that even after 41 years of false identity, Klaus Adler remained present, a ghost haunting the invented life of Hans Keller, never fully exorcised. Despite forensic confirmation that Hans Keller was Klaus Adler, significant gaps remain. Did Adler commit war crimes? His service in reconnaissance operations in occupied Soviet territory placed him in circumstances where atrocities occurred, but no evidence directly implicates him. The question remains unanswerable. Why Uruguay specifically? His journal mentions choosing Uruguay for its smaller German community, but was this the only reason? Did he have contacts there? Investigation found no evidence of pre-existing connections. Did he ever return to Germany? Passport records for Hans Keller show no international travel, but false documents could have facilitated undetected trips. The presence of Maria's crucifix suggests possible retrieval from the bunker, or he carried it with him initially. Unconfirmed. Did he maintain contact with other escapees? The conspiracy of silence among German immigrants suggests possible connections, but no evidence of ongoing relationships exists. What were his final thoughts? The man died alone, silent, carrying his secrets to an unmarked grave. Whatever guilt, regret, justification, or peace he achieved remains locked in his vanished consciousness. One final discovery. In 2024, Uruguayan police reviewing old case files in response to the investigation located a photograph attached to Hans Keller's 1950 residence permit application. The image shows a man in his mid-30s, wearing a plain white shirt, staring directly at the camera with an expression difficult to interpret. The eyes are empty, not hostile, not fearful, simply vacant, as though the person behind them has withdrawn to some unreachable interior space. Comparing this image to the 1939 photograph in Klaus Adler's Soulbuch reveals the transformation. Same bone structure, same features, but different person. The 23-year-old surveyor from Heidelberg who smiled shyly for his military registration photograph had become the 34-year-old ghost who stared blankly at a Montevideo immigration clerk, bearing a false name and a canceled history. That photograph, copied and archived in investigation files, captures the cost of survival, the erasure not just of identity but of self. The Klaus Adler case forces confrontation with questions that resist easy answers. In the decades since World War II, narratives have often been simplified. Clear villains, clear victims, unambiguous moral boundaries. But Adler's story exists in uncomfortable gray zones where judgment becomes complicated. Was Klaus Heinrich Adler a war criminal? The available evidence cannot definitively answer this question. His reconnaissance battalion participated in operations where atrocities occurred, anti-partisan actions in Belarus, intelligence gathering that facilitated mass violence, potential complicity in identifying civilians for execution. Wehrmacht reconnaissance units frequently collaborated with SS Einsatzgruppen. The 56th Infantry Division's operational records contain euphemistic references to security actions that almost certainly meant mass killings. But Adler's personal culpability remains unclear. As an Oberjefreiter, junior enlisted rank, he would have followed orders from superior officers. Did he personally participate in executions? Did he identify villages for destruction? Did he witness atrocities and remain silent? Did he attempt resistance, or simply accept the horror as inevitable? His journal, notably, contains no confessions of war crimes. Skeptics might argue this is self-serving erasure, eliminating evidence. Defenders might suggest that absence of documentation reflects absence of criminal conduct. The truth is unknowable. Dr. Michael Brennan, professor of Holocaust Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, interviewed in February 2024 about the Adler case, observes, "We must resist the temptation to assign collective guilt or collective innocence. Not every German soldier was a war criminal. Not every German soldier was innocent. Adler served in circumstances where atrocities occurred. That creates moral complicity even if he personally pulled no triggers. But it does not automatically make him equivalent to SS officers who organized industrial mass murder. These distinctions matter, even as we acknowledge the difficulty of judgment." Whatever Adler's personal level of guilt, his escape denied potential justice. If he witnessed crimes, he took that testimony to an unmarked grave in Montevideo. If he committed crimes, he evaded accountability. The victims of the 56th Infantry Division's operations, Soviet civilians killed in anti-partisan sweeps, prisoners executed, villages destroyed, received no justice from Klaus Adler's survival. The archive of the International Tracing Service contains thousands of inquiries from Soviet, Polish, and Belarusian families seeking information about relatives who disappeared during German occupation. Many of these cases involve Wehrmacht units conducting security operations in rural areas, mass executions disguised as anti-partisan actions. One such inquiry, filed in 1973 by a Soviet citizen named Dmitry Volkov, seeks information about his grandfather's village in Belarus, Krasnaya Polyana, population 340, destroyed September 1942 during anti-partisan operations. German military records indicate the 56th Infantry Division operated in that region during that period. Reconnaissance elements identified the village as hostile. All inhabitants were executed. The village was burned. Was Klaus Adler involved in Krasnaya Polyana? No evidence links him specifically, but his battalion operated in that area during that period. The reconnaissance intelligence that led to the village's destruction may have been provided by his unit. Dmitry Volkov, seeking answers about his grandfather's death, received only bureaucratic responses. Records incomplete, insufficient evidence to identify specific perpetrators. Case remains unresolved. Meanwhile, one of the men who might have provided information about what happened lived comfortably in South America, his identity hidden, his conscience undisturbed or perhaps tormented. We cannot know. Klaus Adler's escape was not unique. Historical research suggests between 5,000 and 9,000 individuals, Wehrmacht soldiers, SS personnel, Nazi officials, collaborators from occupied territories, successfully escaped prosecution by disappearing into false identities and fleeing to South America, the Middle East, or even remaining hidden within Europe. The most famous cases involved high-ranking officials. Adolf Eichmann, captured 1960 in Argentina. Joseph Mengele died 1979 in Brazil. Never captured. Klaus Barbie, arrested 1983 in Bolivia. But the vast majority were ordinary figures like Adler, men whose names appear in no history books, whose crimes, if any, were small-scale and personal rather than systematic and industrial, who simply melted into the chaos and re-emerged elsewhere as someone new. Argentina alone accepted an estimated 12,000 German immigrants between 1945 and 1955, many under false identities. Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, all became destinations for men seeking escape. The Syrian and Egyptian governments actively recruited former Wehrmacht and SS personnel for military advisory roles, providing protection and new identities. Within Germany itself, thousands lived under false identities for years or decades. The division of Germany into occupation zones created bureaucratic confusion that many exploited. By the time authorities established functioning background check systems, countless false identities had been solidified through years of documentation. The broader truth: Klaus Adler's escape was one thread in a vast network that allowed thousands to evade consequences. Whether this represents failure of justice or pragmatic acceptance of reality depends on perspective. One unsettling aspect of Adler's story is the admiration his meticulous planning and successful execution might evoke. The reconnaissance scout applied his professional skills, navigation, risk assessment, intelligence gathering, to engineer a nearly flawless escape. From a purely technical standpoint, his operation demonstrates impressive competence. Yet admiring the skill cannot be separated from condemning the purpose. Adler's abilities might have been used for noble purposes in different circumstances. Instead, they facilitated evading accountability in the aftermath of history's most documented evil. Dr. Hannah Fischer, ethicist at the University of Vienna, comments, "We face this dilemma repeatedly when examining history. We can simultaneously recognize someone's intelligence or courage while condemning their choices. The difficulty is maintaining both perspectives, not collapsing into pure vilification that denies complexity, but also not romanticizing escape and survival in ways that minimize moral weight." Adler's story demands we hold these tensions. The Allied approach to post-war justice was necessarily selective. Prosecuting every German who participated in the war machine would have required imprisoning millions. The choice was made to focus on leadership, documented atrocities, and clear-cut cases while allowing lower-level personnel to reintegrate into society, assuming they had not committed specific, provable crimes. This pragmatic approach created gaps that individuals like Adler exploited. But the alternative, a total prosecutorial ambition, would have been logistically impossible and potentially counterproductive to rebuilding stable governance in occupied Germany. The question becomes, was justice served by prosecuting thousands while millions escaped accountability? Or is this the unavoidable compromise of applying legal frameworks to historical catastrophes of unprecedented scale? Perhaps the answer is that perfect justice is impossible in the aftermath of such comprehensive destruction. The goal becomes achieving whatever accountability is feasible while accepting that many questions will remain forever unresolved, many crimes forever unpunished, many victims suffering never acknowledged. Finally, Klaus Adler's story reminds us that historical events are experienced at the level of individual human beings, people with families, fears, hopes, moral complexities. Reducing Adler to a statistic, one among millions of German soldiers, erases his specific choices and circumstances. Elevating him to a representative symbol of Nazi evil distorts his particular, limited culpability. He was a reconnaissance scout who served in a criminal war, a husband and father whose family was destroyed, a skilled survivor who exploited chaos to escape, a man who lived 40 years under false identity carrying whatever burden of memory and guilt he possessed, and ultimately a forgotten figure who died alone holding his dead wife's crucifix. All these things are simultaneously true. History's meaning emerges not from simplification, but from wrestling with complexity. April 15, 2024. The Alpine bunker now preserved as historical site. the Bavarian State Office for Monument Protection has stabilized the entrance to Klaus Adler's hideout, installed safety barriers, and erected informational plaques describing the discovery and its historical significance. The site is not publicized. Its remote location and difficult access make it unsuitable for casual tourism. But historians, researchers, and journalists have visited to witness the place where one man paused in his transformation from soldier to exile. Standing at the bunker's entrance, looking out across the forested mountain slopes toward the valley below, it is easy to imagine Obergefreiter Adler here in late April 1945, the war grinding to its apocalyptic conclusion, the future entirely uncertain. The decision made: survive, whatever the cost. The bunker's interior remains largely as discovered. The deteriorated cot, the rusted stove, the empty food tins, the footlocker where the journal waited 78 years to reveal its secrets. Visitors speak in hushed tones, as though the weight of history demands reverence or perhaps simply caution in the face of what cannot be fully understood. Dr. Marcus Hoffman, whose glaciology survey accidentally revealed this site, reflects, "We came here to study climate change, how retreating snow exposes landscape features long hidden. In a sense, that's exactly what we found, a landscape feature that was hidden, but also a human story that time buried and then released. The mountain kept Klaus Adler's secret for 78 years. The question is, how many other secrets do these mountains keep?" The forensic investigation concluded, the DNA analysis confirmed, the escape route reconstructed, the final resting place identified. Yet for all the questions answered, equally many remain unresolved. What did Klaus Adler feel as he sat in this bunker, writing in his journal, transforming from soldier to fugitive? Did he grieve for his wife and daughter, or had trauma numbed him beyond emotion? Did he justify his escape as survival, or did guilt accompany him across 2 continents and 4 decades? When Hans Keller died in Montevideo, holding Maria's crucifix, did he find peace or only cessation? Did he believe his survival had meaning, or had 40 years of invented identity convinced him that Klaus Adler had truly died in 1945, leaving only a ghost inhabiting borrowed existence? These questions have no answers. The dead keep their silence. The British Cemetery in Montevideo has been contacted about placing a plaque at the formerly unmarked grave, identifying it as Klaus Heinrich Adler. The decision remains pending. Officials debate whether a man who lived under false identity for 41 years deserves posthumous recognition of his true name, or whether Hans Keller's anonymity should be respected. Perhaps both names, Klaus Adler and Hans Keller, represent equally valid and equally false identities. The man who was born in 1916 and died in 1986 lived multiple lives. The pre-war surveyor, the Wehrmacht reconnaissance scout, the widowed fugitive, the Montevideo bookkeeper. Which name captures the essence of who he actually was? History teaches us that human identity is never as fixed or simple as we pretend. Circumstances transform us, trauma recreates us. Survival sometimes requires becoming someone new. Klaus Adler's story is extreme but not unique. Countless refugees, exiles, survivors, and escapees throughout history have crossed borders, assumed new names, buried their pasts, and reconstructed themselves from fragments of who they once were. The difference, the troubling difference, is that many of those who remake themselves are fleeing persecution, seeking safety, escaping victimization. Klaus Adler was fleeing accountability. His transformation, whatever its human complexity, was ultimately an evasion of consequences. Yet even that judgment, however justified, cannot be the final word, because Klaus Adler's story ultimately asks each of us, what would we do? Faced with probable imprisonment or death, having lost everything that gave life meaning, possessing skills and opportunity to escape, would we resist the temptation? Would we surrender to abstract justice, or would we run towards survival? Most of us, safely distant from such choices, believe we would act honorably. But Klaus Adler's life whispers a disturbing possibility, that honor and morality are luxuries more easily maintained when the costs are theoretical. When consequences become existential, when survival conflicts with accountability, perhaps more of us would make Adler's choice than we care to admit. The Alpine bunker, silent among the trees at 1,847 meters elevation, offers no answers. It simply exists as physical testament to one man's passage through history's catastrophe, proof that survival is possible, even when identity must be sacrificed, evidence that secrets can endure for decades before accidents of time and circumstance expose them. And it reminds us that beneath our feet, in archives, in sealed files, in distant cemeteries with unmarked graves, in the memories of the elderly who choose silence, in the gaps between official records and actual events, countless other stories wait, unknown and perhaps unknowable, truths that may never surface. Sometimes the earth keeps secrets for 78 years. Sometimes it keeps them forever. How many Klaus Adlers remain undiscovered, their bunkers uncovered, their journals unread, their graves unmarked, their true names forgotten? How many histories have we not yet unearthed?